If you're experiencing hip pain in your yoga practice, then stay tuned because I have a bit of experience in this area, and I hope that by sharing my experience, then I'm going to give you some ideas on what you can do inside of your yoga practice and outside of your practice to help try and relieve that pain. If you're looking forward to learning with me today, then make sure you click the thumbs up button to like the video below. And then if you're not already subscribed, you know what to do. Click the subscribe button and then the bell, and you'll get a notification whenever I post a new video. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about my journey with hip pain in yoga. I'd never experienced hip pain in my life until about 5 years into my yoga practice, into my Ashtanga yoga practice. And all of a sudden, I started to get this pinching sensation or a feeling of compression in my hip joint whenever I was doing any pose that required deep hip flexion and internal rotation. So poses like the twists, like Marichyasana C, D, Parshvakonasana B in the standing sequence as well. There were a number of different poses that were exacerbating this pain. And at first it was just when I was doing the postures. And then gradually over time, when I didn't learn my lesson, it started to get worse, and the pain actually was present for most of the day. So I could always feel this pinching, this kind of grinding sensation in my hip joint. So I decided that it was about time I went to go and see a therapist. So I went to a physio, a chiropractor, an osteopath, and also an orthopedic consultant. And the general consensus among all of them was that I had what's known as FAI, which stands for femoro-acetabular impingement. So the femur is the thigh bone, and the acetabulum is the hip joint. So your thigh bone slots into the acetabulum, femur acetabulum, like this. And essentially, FAI is when your hip joint is shaped in such a way, like a slightly irregular way, so that there's friction and compression between those two bones. I had an x-ray done with the consultant, and he was able to show me that I have a small lump on my femur on both sides, which is known as a cam pincer. And that means whenever I go into a specific position with my hip joint, the bone will, that kind of lump will rub on the acetabulum, on the hip socket. So it causes inflammation and pain and general discomfort. The treatment options for FAI were, number one, stop the activity that you're doing that's creating the sensation of pain. So that would mean for me, I would have to greatly reduce my mobility, my range of motion, in my yoga practice. Number two was to have a steroid injection in the hip, and that would help to reduce the pain and the inflammation. And number three was to have the bone shaved down, so that lump on the bone, you could have that shaved off, so that I'm a bit squeamish, so that's going through me. You can have it shaved off so that when the bone moves around, there's no compression with those 2 points. The treatment for FAI is fairly limited because, as was explained to me when I went to the consultant, it's a bone shape problem. So you can't change the shape of your bones unless you are going to have the shaved bone procedure. And therefore, you just have to accept it and avoid whatever it is that's causing you the pain. Spoiler alert, I don't know if I believe that it is a joint problem, but more about that later. So I didn't want to have the bone surgery just so that I could do Marichyasana C. I didn't want to take a steroid injection because if I didn't have the pain present, then I know that I wouldn't have the feedback of which postures and which positions were causing me the compression. And finally, reducing the range of motion was definitely my only option at that point, because there was nothing else that would reduce the pain. But something wasn't sitting right with me about the diagnosis, because if I'd had this bone shape all of my life, how come it only very suddenly started to create these symptoms? And maybe you could argue that my range of motion had increased, and that's why I was suddenly accessing a new range that allowed those bones to touch. But it just didn't feel right, because in postures like Marichyasana C, I didn't feel that my rotation and flexion has changed that much. It's more that my upper back has opened and allowed me to start moving deeper into a twist. So I started to do my own research. So I read a bunch of different articles, scientific journals, and peer-reviewed studies, literature reviews of all of the information that's out there about FAI. I watched all of the YouTube videos under the sun about the problem, about the condition, and took in loads of different people's opinions and what's worked for them in their own bodies, and then also for those people who are therapists, what they've done for their clients. I came across a YouTube channel called Upright Health, and I'm going to link to their channel in the box below. If you have hip pain, then you have to check them out because they have so many good videos that explain the problem. All of my research led me to a different model of FAI. So the existing model that I'd been explained was that this problem is something to do with the shape of your bones, and so it's foolish to think that you can change it. You just have to work around it. The new model that many therapists are using and finding a lot of success with in their clinical practice is it's actually a muscular imbalance problem. So this makes so much more sense to me because the way that I was explained it was if your hip joint is sitting in the if the thigh bone is sitting in the acetabulum like this, if you have a nice balance of the muscles in the front of the hips and the back of the hips, then your thigh bone is going to sit bang in the middle of the socket, and it's going to be happy and it's going to move around and it's not going to be too far forwards or too far back. If, however, you start to increase the tension and the tightness in the front of your hip joints, let's say top is the front, your thigh bone will be pulled forwards by that tension. So it means that you're reducing the space between the bone and the acetabulum. And of course, if you're doing a practice like a yoga practice, for example, which is slightly imbalanced towards the front or the back of your body, and you repeat this 6 days a week, then of course you can imagine that tension at the front of the hip is going to increase to the point where you're actually changing the position of the bone in the socket. And this really started to ring true for me because I've noticed in my Ashtanga practice that I became really strong in my hip flexors and weak in my glutes. And these two muscles are actually antagonists. So the hip flexors and the glutes work together. So one of them contracts and the other relaxes. So if you have your hip flexors always contracting, for example, forward bending all the time, we're using our hip flexors usually, at least somewhat, to fold forwards, or at least we're in a shortened position with the hip flexors. The glutes are switched off for most of the practice unless you're doing some conscious work to switch them on. And so gradually over time, these hip flexors are getting tighter and tighter. Not to mention the fact that for the rest of the day, at the time anyway, I had an office job. And so I would do my forward bend heavy practice, tightening up the hip flexors. Then I would sit for a number of hours a day. And then I was confused as to why it was shifting the position of my hip joint. So the solution then becomes really simple. If you have too much hip flexion, so strong hip flexors, that means that your acetabulum and your femur are being pushed together. So the hip flexors at the front are pulling your femur forwards. The answer is you have to strengthen your glutes more to pull it back to the center and try to balance out the tension between the hips and the glutes, the hip flexors and the glutes, so that your hip joint comes out of that position. Lucky for me, Upright Health had an online program which is called the Fai Fix. I'm not affiliated with it in any way, but it did work really well for me. So it's a set of exercises that you go through in your own time and a set of diagnostic tests to see which exercises will be best for you. For me, when I found the right exercises, sometimes I even got immediate relief from that feeling of compression in the hips. And of course, once I stopped doing the exercises, it's kind of crept back throughout the day. But as I kept working on it and strengthening the back side of my body, my glutes, more and more, it stopped creeping back. So I would go for days without any hip pain at all, and then maybe it would crop up one day and I'd be like, oh, I haven't done my exercises in 3 days, and I'd do it again, and gradually over time that tension in the glutes started to build up more and more. And I don't know about you, but a lot of people, when they start practicing yoga, they say that they lose their butt. So if you've been used to doing like a lot of sporty activities like running and maybe lifting weights, and then you just change to yoga, for me certainly, I absolutely lost all of the mass in my glutes, and that was probably a really telling sign that I'd lost the strength in my glutes. And so no wonder if I have really tight muscles on one side of my body and really weak muscles on the other, no wonder it's causing me problems in my hip joints. So what can you learn from my experience if you're having similar symptoms of kind of like an aching or a pinching or compressed feeling in your hip joints? Well, the first thing I would say is definitely go and see a physical therapist, because they can assess you and tell you what they think the problem is. They'll probably give you some exercises to do to help. But secondly, if you find out that you have been diagnosed with FAI, or this hip impingement, try what I've tried. So try strengthening your glutes and stretching your hip flexors. So anything to stretch the hip flexors, you should be doing a few times a day, especially if you have a job that's sitting at a desk, because even if your entire yoga practice is focused on stretching your hip flexors. So let's say you do an hour of yoga in the morning and your hip flexors feel really good and really stretched, but then you go and sit down at a desk for the rest of your day, then your hip flexors are not going to respond well, because that just means that 1 hour out of 24 hours is spent stretching. Whereas you need to try and really build up the amount of time that you're stretching your hips. So stretch your hip flexors, and 2 is strengthen your glutes. I think almost all of us could do with having stronger glutes, because naturally the way that we are in society means that we spend more time sitting and shortened in the front of the hips, and less time running, jumping, doing squatting, all of the things that help to build up strong glutes in the back of the hips. So go and see a therapist, definitely number 1. Number 2, stretch your hips and strengthen your glutes. And number 3, in your yoga practice, you need to start shifting the focus of your postures from tightening your hips to stretching your hips. So some of the things you could do, if you're practicing a lot of primary series, why don't you ask your teacher if you can start to incorporate some of the back bends from second series, because they really help to lengthen your hip flexors and stretch the hips, and then you'll stop focusing so much on forward bending. You could also work on engaging your glutes more when you're practicing your standing postures, for example. They're usually switched on at least a little bit throughout your practice, but you need to try and make an even more concerted effort to keep them on when you're moving and when you're doing things like your forward bends, because this will switch off the hip flexors a little bit too. So when you squeeze your glutes, the hip flexors will relax a little, and that's the kind of effect that you're after. And of course, if there are specific postures that are flaring up your hips and causing inflammation, you're definitely going to have to back off from those postures for a certain amount of time. It might not be forever. So for example, for me, I was finding that Marichyasana C was absolutely impossible. So to begin, I would do the bind, and then gradually I just moved on to doing this. And eventually it was so sore, I couldn't even bend my thigh all the way up to my chest. Whereas now, having worked so hard to build up the strength in my glutes and constantly working on stretching my hip flexors, Marichyasana is accessible to me again, and I can do the bind and it's quite comfortable and I don't get the pinching in my hips. So work intelligently with every single pose, try to understand where the pain is coming from and which muscles you might need to switch on to shift the attention away from the hips. This video was a little bit of a ramble from me, but I hope that by sharing my experience of FAI and this hip impingement condition, that it's going to give you some ideas and plant some seeds as to the kind of research you want to do, the kind of approach you want to take with the condition and with your treatment. If you enjoyed my little story today, then make sure you give the video a like by clicking the thumbs up button below. It really helps my videos to reach more people, so thank you for doing that. And if you subscribe to my channel and click the bell, you'll get notified when I post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you have a question, leave it in the comment box below and I'll be sure to respond to you. And I will see you next week for my next video.